All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Wednesday webinar as part of the Power of Place Summit. My name is CJ Oberthauser. I'm the Director of Training and Placemaking here at Grow Smart. We're really glad you can join us. Thanks for being here. We obviously wish we could be seeing y'all in person, but we're very glad that you'll be able to, that you're with us today. And we're glad that this online format at least allows for, I think, more people to be joining us and to potentially join every single webinar, every single panel instead of just a couple. We do have a Wednesday webinar every single Wednesday between now and September 25th. You can check out a full roster of those webinars on our website. There's a whole menu there. Being able to be on these webinars is included with your full summit ticket. You'll get a code that allows you to get into all these. It's included with that. And if you don't have a full summit ticket, you're welcome to join us for they're $10 a pop. So again, feel free to look at the menu there and sign up for one or two. On September 25th, we're going to have kind of a mini summit, a half-day virtual plenary. It's going to feature Scott Spencer of Smart Growth America and the Annie Casey Foundation, as well as award-winning columnist E.J. Dion of the Washington Post and Brookings Institution. And we'll have some other speakers and panels, and we'll have our awards ceremony virtually as well. So there's a lot going on in kind of a half day. So feel free to, hope you'll be able to join us on the 25th. Want to say thank you. Oh, you'll see first of all, you'll see our panelists below, and I'll thank them right now. Thank you guys for being here and being part of this. Their full bios are on our website, so you can check those out if you're interested. Also want to say thank you in addition to our sponsors, pictured right here. All of these webinars that we have coming up, by the way, the Wednesday webinars, they're all approved for one AICP credit. So feel free, if you're seeking those, to log it in on the AICP. The credit, there's a web page for that online. We are going to have a Q&A panel at the end, a discussion at the end of today's webinar. But between now and then, at any time, feel free to use the Q&A function here in Zoom to input your question, and we'll reserve plenty of time at the end to get to those. Lastly, this is being recorded, so you'll have access to this again later if you want to jot down some notes or what have you. So don't fear, this won't be your only interaction with this wonderful panel. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking and unshare and hand it over to Arnold.
Great, thanks CJ. I'm gonna do a very quick intro just really by name and position of the folks that are gonna be speaking. They'll do a little more self-introduction to give you a context for how their work applies. So I'm Arnold Robinson, Regional Director of Planning with Fuss & O'Neill. We've also got with us Bob Ruley, who's the Director of Planning and Community Development for Town of Warren, Rhode Island, and Michael Baer, who's Managing Director, the Program and Business Development with Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. And we're going to be talking about the intersection between the issues of smart growth and climate change. And to get right into it, we're defining this pretty narrowly for today because obviously those topics of smart growth and climate change are very broad, and we're looking at that intersection with specific attention to Rhode Island because our geography and our climate impacts are different, but also some examples that are going on in the state. So if you look at those first two bullets, what we're really talking about here are, we're going to make reference to the first kind of impact, which is existing centers. We have in Rhode Island, lots of clusters and zones that epitomize smart growth that were developed historically, and those face threats. The second, though, is talking about opportunities for redevelopment, and what can a time of change present us for opportunities for redevelopment that is in the model of smart growth, that uses the best smart growth principles. So we'll be highlighting those. I'll give a little intro that'll give you some context and background, but then I'm really going to be turning this over to the experts who are doing this in the field. And Bob Ruley will be giving us the case study of how Warren is approaching this issue. And lessons learned there and where they're going in the future. And then we'll also be hearing from Michael about connection to financing tools to support this kind of vision for adaptation in the face of climate change and preservation of those existing smart zones and redevelopment. And we also want to create connections with you. We want to see this as the beginning of a dialogue, not an end, where we're sharing best practices and implementation. That's, I think, what the nature of the Grow Smart Summit is all about, is not a one-time hit of information, but sort of creating functional relationships. So when we talk about threats to existing areas of smart growth, I wanted to pick an example that was over from the West Bay, just because Bob's going to talk about Warren. And so I think about Wickford as being the sort of great case study of how smart growth developed historically and how it functions well. A good downtown with storefront retail, with services, with restaurants, with banks, surrounded by residential neighborhoods, and accessible and connected to other neighborhoods around it, while also being accessible to some transit lines nearby and to water, and so sort of natural amenities that's out there. So this is an existing aerial shot showing Warren. You may recognize this. Most of my images are going to come from the Storm Tools web application, which allows us to forecast impacts from storm events. And this image is the blue is everything that's going to get inundated in a 100-year storm, which is not an abnormal storm, sort of a hurricane, with 2 foot of sea level rise. And if you've been paying attention lately, what we thought was going to be the horizon line for sort of 2100 as a year seems to be rapidly increasing, that we're getting closer to that. So this is blue is the areas of inundation. Those shaded blue, excuse me, our water depth. And I just point picked something that's on Washington Street, fantastic residential street right along the water. That would be 11 feet underwater in that 100-year storm event with 2 feet of sea level rise. So that's that potential impact. And on the left-hand side, you'll just see a list of communities, largely coastal in Rhode Island. I think we think about sea level rise and storm events, but don't forget riverine flooding as well. In narrow river valleys like Woonsocket, Burrillville, other communities upstate, that's another impact. Increased precipitation events lead to increased river flooding. So I really want to think about this as opportunities for smart growth. The image on the right is not anything historical. That's yesterday on America's Cup Boulevard in Newport. This was posted to Discover Newport's Facebook feed. And this was, while during a high tide, only an average high tide of 3.6 feet, not one of the spring tides we get, which go over 5 feet in height. And so basically this is stormwater hitting a high tide point and flooding out major streets in our centers that we think of as good smart growth. And this is an event we're going to continue to see. So radical change, my logic statement on the left over here is that radical changes in weather events, these kind of precipitation events, plus sea level rise, which we're seeing, are going to force radical changes in behavior. And I really identify that as there's 3 major groups. There's more you can make the argument for, but I would say you're going to see that for property owners who have to make different decisions about their properties, municipalities that are charged with maintaining infrastructure, delivering services, dealing with emergencies, and thinking about the long-term future for those communities, and also advocates like Grow Smart Rhode Island, like environmental organizations, who are going to have to think differently and more rapidly in the face of this change. But I think that's an opportunity for all of us. I want to reference the fact that we don't have to tackle this alone, and we don't have to tackle this in a vacuum. There's a lot of resources. URI with Sea Grant and several of their programs have put fantastic resources out there. Storm Tools being one of the ones we're going to taking a look at. There's national resources with First Street Foundation. There's the Municipal Resilience Program. After this program, we can share a list of those resources out there. Point being that I think this is a really opportune time to be a smart growth advocate and to be thinking about the ways that change can happen and how you can affect things on the ground in your own community in the face of this change. So I'm going to hand it over to Bob Ruley to talk about how his municipality, the town of Warren, is addressing these bigger existential issues on a local level and making meaningful change take place. Bob?
Thank you, Arnold. I appreciate it. And thanks to John and CJ and Grow Smart Rhode Island for hosting these webinars and for all the good work that they do We certainly have enjoyed our partnership with them over the years. As you can see from this historic overview, Warren is surrounded by water on three sides. That's both the good news and the bad news. And, you know, Warren is unique in that we have our historic downtown area of Main Street, Water Street, the 114 corridor. And it's on the Warren River side. Not a lot that we can do with respect to making it flood proof. Try to educate residents with respect to the effects of sea level rise and being prepared for resiliency. I think the best indication of that is our wastewater treatment plant is located on Water Street. In order to be in compliance with DM regulations, we had to make a commitment to make a serious upgrade to that plant. The town voters authorized $21 million in bond funding that we worked with the infrastructure bank on and the state revolving loan fund. And if you have the opportunity to go by there, you'll see that that plant is designed to anticipate what sea level rise would be in 60 years, taking into consideration storm surge and wave action. So the reactors are at an elevation now that would prevent them from being flooded. And if you live across the street from that plant, you should be very worried that your house would be underwater. So that was kind of one of the first steps in smart growth for us, looking at, you know, as we looked at the amount of money we needed to make the upgrades, doing a cost benefit analysis in terms of what equipment we could sacrifice, what couldn't be sacrificed, and, you know, the fact that we needed to keep that important infrastructure online. As part of the Tourister mill conversion and Tourister phase 2 new construction, we needed to upgrade the pump station at the north end of town. If you come in across the Warren-Barrington Bridge on the left-hand side, that pump station just came online July 1st. That is also built to the same standards as the wastewater treatment plant. If you go to the next slide, Arnold. So areas of water that we have to address is the Warren River, the Palmer River, Belcher's Cove, which is kind of that area where Market Street comes down and loops back up to Main Street. And then we have the Kickamuit River coming from Mount Hope Bay in the eastern section of town. What's interesting is that our major transportation hubs are all state highways, and all of those transportation hubs are evacuation routes, and each of those evacuations routes is susceptible and vulnerable to flooding. So that's a conversation as the state has just released their updated tip, even though they don't engage the municipalities that often in the conversation, talking about how they're going to address sea level rise and stormwater is a necessary part of that conversation. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the poster child that we use this photo for the effects of sea level rise. This is Market Street near where J Mills Park is. This is a non-rain event. It's a king tide event. And we like to use this picture because not only are you seeing that the road is flooded, but in this area, you've got an auto body shop, a furniture stripping business, and a dry cleaner. So from an environmental standpoint, we obviously are concerned every time there's flooding, what the environmental impacts are going to be, in addition to property loss and safety issues. So over the last several years, we've worked very closely with URI and the Coastal Institute. We've been a demonstration project with Barrington. We're in the process of updating our comprehensive plan, so we're addressing some of these things. We were one of the first in the first group of municipalities to participate with the Infrastructure Bank and the Nature Conservancy on the Municipal Resiliency Program. We partnered with Barrington on that. We've had the benefit of having students from the University of Pennsylvania School of Design through a grant through the Van Buren Charitable Trust come and do a design studio in both Warren and Barrington, working on resiliency and sea level rise. So it's something that we've spent a lot of time engaging the public on and are continuing to. Next slide, please. So again, areas that we are really focused on is the Belchers Cove neighborhood. In addition to these businesses, it's an area that not only is the housing stock at risk, but a large percentage of the housing in this area is rental housing. And I would say that it's at-risk housing, not just for flooding, but absentee landlords, and it's housing that doesn't necessarily even qualify for Section 8 because it's not safe, decent, but it is affordable. And so it's an area that we're concerned with, that it's constantly going to be flooded. Are landlords going to do the right thing? What are the environmental consequences of people just abandoning properties? So that's got us thinking about what other areas in the town could we possibly develop. And one of the things that came out of some of our meetings when we had the UPenn students here, and Laura Sullivan from DOA joined us in one of those meetings, we talked about the idea of doing housing buyouts. And we have experience in the state of doing housing buyouts in other parts of the state that may not have worked out as well as they were anticipated, because they were reacting to a situation where we're trying to be a little bit more proactive and get ahead of a situation that we know that there's going to be impacts to flooding and sea level rise in the future. And how can we prepare for that? So when we look in town, there are only certain areas that we have the ability to develop. As I said, the 114 corridor, Main Street, Water Street is our historic district. There are very few opportunities for new development in this area. The town has acquired the former National Grid property if you come over the bridge from Barrington. We're in the process of developing a plan with the developer for that site. But because of environmental land use restrictions, that cannot be a housing site. Our Main Street, like many main streets in older New England towns, it was kind of on the early forefront of smart growth because you had commercial businesses on the ground level and residential on the upper floors. A lot of that's been abandoned on Main Street now, and we think there's an opportunity to kind of revisit that, creating some investment opportunities for workforce housing in those upper levels. But it doesn't give us the amount of housing that we would need if we were to look at the Belchers Cove, Market Street area, if we had to do large buyouts and abandon that area. Next slide, please. So again, just using the Storm Tools map, you see, and I don't know, is this at 5 feet, Arnold, or, but in any event, I mean, you can see what the impacts of flooding would be. In that area, all in the blue are the areas that we are talking about. The next slide, please. So when you pull back from that a little bit, and then you see the areas that aren't as susceptible to flooding, one area that we're going to focus on is the 136 corridor, which is the Metacom Avenue corridor. And that really is the last opportunity that we have for development in the town. The eastern portion of town is largely agricultural and residential, but it lacks public infrastructure. There's no public water, no public sewer, and there's not a strong appetite to bring that to that area. And Bristol County Water, who is the local water authority, has not expressed any interest to make that investment. It is something we're going to need to look at in the future, but it's not an area that we see to be right for high density development. So when we look at the Metacom corridor, I like to say that it represents the best in 1950s, 1960s planning. We've got a 4-lane road. Many of the buildings are pushed back from the road. They tend to be 1-story park in the front type of businesses. And so as we look at, where there are opportunities, we thought that, if we can upzone this area, it gives us an opportunity to accomplish a number of different goals. It gives us the opportunity to have create new mixed income housing opportunities. So if we had to relocate people out of areas that were susceptible to flooding, we don't want them to move out of town. They're valuable people and they contribute to our community. We'd like to keep them in town. We've got a state highway that has limited public transportation that could be improved. But we also have these large surface areas that are contributing to stormwater problems and kind of creating an urban jungle. So if you're familiar with Warren, probably the largest site for opportunity that we have, which is shown here, is the Job Lot Plaza. Currently, that land area is just over 500,000 square feet. So when we look at development opportunities, and what I presented to our town council earlier this year was doing a zoning map amendment for the entire corridor. So if we looked at an area, just at this site as an example, if we were to upzone it to, I would say moderate scale, nothing more than 4 stories, we could create approximately 1.2 million square feet of development. And that would be in several different buildings. So the way we looked at it was, if we had 40% of land coverage, that we could create 453 units of housing, approximately 900,000 square feet of retail, and mix of retail and or office. Those units of housing were based on an average of 1,500 square feet. So they're decent size. When we looked at the entire corridor, we have the ability to develop about 6 million square feet of development in an area where right now we have about 3, so we can almost double it. But, again, the opportunity is to, create more transit-oriented development at a scale that respects the surrounding neighborhoods, but also allows us to, include more trees, improve more stormwater drainage, work with DOT to make that 4-lane road a 3-lane road, make a better connection for bike paths from the eastern part of town to the East Bay bike path. And again, at a scale that is achievable. So part of our plan is to adopt form-based code so that we could have a predictable development scheme, have an expedited approval process. And also, part of our plan would be to identify this as a special revitalization district, which would allow us to utilize tax increment financing. And the idea is that some of those proceeds from the TIF could be used to facilitate the buyouts in those areas where we need to relocate people out of that we think are going to be susceptible to flooding. So using Metacom as a special revitalization district, the Market Street area, where Metacom intersects at just past Child Street, that becomes Market Street to the Mass border. Little bit different feel there. That's a 2-lane road, but still has the same amount of traffic flow. That's an area that probably is more, not necessarily prone to residential development, though it could have some, but more manufacturing. And we're seeing a lot of that now. The TPI building that was purchased, that's almost completely built out now. There's small manufacturing. There seems to be a real need for that and not a lot of supply. And then we look at the Market Street, Upper Main Street, Child Street area, all of those being special revitalization districts, which would give us a little bit more flexibility in terms of some of the things we could do with respect to zoning. And the idea is, again, by increasing density, we're increasing opportunities, we're increasing property values. So we've started to engage with the owners of Ocean State Job Lot Plaza. It's Royal Holt, who's the parent company for Stop and Shop and a lot of other large supermarket chains. And somewhat unique that typically it's the developer that's coming to the municipality looking for a zone change or an increase in density, where we think that being proactive in the town taking the lead in educating the public in terms of why we're doing this, having them be part of the process in terms of adopting the form-based code, having them understand what that is and how predictable it is a good approach. And the initial conversations that we've had with the community and the council have been very favorable. And as I had said earlier, as we're in the process of updating our comprehensive plan, we can address many of these elements in there. We can address the environmental, we can address the housing, we can address the economic development, we can address the transportation, and that will all be part of that conversation. So it's really giving us an opportunity to kind of take a holistic approach to how we kind of reinvent what Warren is by at the same time preserving what we want to preserve. We had put in an application. We've gotten notice that we have the award through SNEP to kind of do an in-depth look at both the environmental and economic impacts of both the Metacom corridor and the Market Street, and what are the benefits that would result from kind of the zoning changes that we have contemplated. The next slide, please. So again, I think most of you, the form-based code, certainly not going to read all of this. It has been utilized in other parts of the country. In my past life, down in the Metro DC area, we had an area similar to Metacom Avenue where we adopted this. And it's allowing developers a predictable, expedited approval process. They're not obligated to follow the form-based code, but if they don't, then they need to go through the typical planning and zoning review, which is not as predictable as we all know. But again, it's important for us that as COVID has certainly interrupted our ability to have the number of public meetings we want to have, but hopefully as we get into fall, we'll re-engage with the community. But it's important that they understand what form-based code is, and not just the size of the buildings, but the architectural style, the materials, the massing on the site, the transition back to the residential neighborhoods, which are behind either side of Metacom Avenue. And again, showing a scale of buildings such as this in terms of, this is, because I think a lot of people are more visual learners than seeing it in the abstract. So it gives them a sense to see how the building relates to the street. The benefit of bringing the building to the street edge versus having it pushed to the back. And so not that it's going to look like this, but again, we think it helps give some perspective to the residents. And again, something like we show here, you could have this much development on that Metacom Plaza, which would look a lot different and be a lot better than what we have there now, and becomes, obviously you want it to become kind of a village or neighborhood center that people in those surrounding communities can benefit from, being able to access businesses and services that don't necessarily have to drive in their car. But we also look to the amount of people that commute through Warren to either go to Aquidneck Island, or the number of people that live in Warren that commute to Providence. We look at what the potential expansion of Roger Williams University is, and what they're limited to in their current footprint. So we think, again, there's an opportunity to kind of maximize what's underutilized now and do it in a smart way. And at the same time, the reason we're doing it is because we know we have sea level rise and flooding issues in an area of town that we just can't ignore. So the window for this is, the planning process is ongoing now. The conversations with property owners has started. The conversations about housing buyouts is ongoing. There is a group of stakeholders that has been meeting periodically over the last 18 to 24 months. Again, people's focus now is, COVID and response and recovery, but at the same time, the problems that we're trying to address in the future are not going away. So we've continued to have these conversations and don't think that we can necessarily rely on the state or the federal government to provide all the necessary funding to have a comprehensive buyout strategy. So we're looking to say, okay, where can we maximize things, leverage those assets, and create additional funding opportunities to do some of the things we need to do where we don't want development. Next slide. So again, with the tax increment financing, I mean, it's going to allow us, based on what we see to be the upside, the development, it's going to create, a substantial amount of additional tax revenue. Whether all or some of that goes towards, home buyouts, I mean, that's going to be a decision of the council based on, what the development looks like. TIF is, enabled by Rhode Island state legislation now. Don't know that it's been used yet to the scale that we're anticipating. I know that, certain communities are definitely looking at TIF. We're not looking to use TIF money to benefit National Grid by undergrounding their utilities. I mean, we're looking to reinvest it in the community to help our residents. Next slide, please. And again, the transportation improvements. I mean, any of us that work in municipal government, what a delight it is to work with DOT and how we're engaged in conversation with them. And I say that facetiously. The fact that, the 136 corridor, you come from the Mass line, you come in on, as I said, Market Street's a 2-lane road. Suddenly it becomes a 4-lane road, and then you get to the Bristol Town line, it becomes a 3-lane road with no explanation. So, I mean, at a minimum, we think it needs to be reconfigured to be a 3-lane road. The traffic will flow better by having those designated turning lanes. But again, it's populated right now by just a series of 1-story park in the front underutilized buildings. So, I mean, and again, by creating the amount of housing that we can create there, you think that, again, it will support public transportation. As Aquidneck Island, goes through their build out, I think the opportunity to have better public transportation for people coming to work on the island. The 136 corridor is kind of a natural transportation hub. The Route 60 bus, which comes on the 114 corridor to between Providence and Newport, is one of the most heavily utilized routes that RIPTA has. We think that this could be as well. Last year, we were able to get RIPTA to start a bus on the corridor. Unfortunately, it runs at inconvenient hours and it ends at Fish Road and Tiverton, and I'm not sure who goes there at 6 o'clock in the morning. But so I think, some communication on how there could be a better transfer point for that bus at, Roger Williams area or on the other side of the bridge so people can continue into Newport, are all opportunities that we're looking at. Next slide, please. And again, I mean, some of the, can you go back one, please, Arnold? Again, the advantages of the form-based code is, it just gives everyone, an opportunity to understand not why we're doing it, but how we're doing it, but also seeing the benefits of why we're doing it. And, when you kind of break it into these, kind of easy bullet points, I think it's a lot easier for people to understand and get behind and support, so that, again, they feel like they have some say in the communication, and it's not a developer just coming in and asking that, for permission to build a 15-story building. And again, just kind of summarizing what our priorities are is just, maximizing what we have now that's underutilized, creating a vision that the community get behind. But, oftentimes, communities, it becomes paralysis by analysis, that we do studies and people get enthusiastic about it, but the implementation piece is missing. And sometimes that's because there's not the funding in order to make that happen, or there just isn't a plan to make it happen. And we think it's important to have all of those pieces discussed at the same time, so we're not just studying something, we are an ability to implement it. And we engage early on with Commerce. We've engaged with the Infrastructure Bank with Michael and his colleagues, kind of talking about, financing strategies. Is there opportunities to leverage the TIF funding? Can we borrow against that? We spoke earlier, is there super TIFs? So, I mean, these are conversations that need to happen. Again, the idea is that we don't want to rely on the state to give us direction to do this. We think we're in a better position, understanding our community and what our residents want and what our businesses want, and also understanding what risks that we have in front of us, that this is, really an example of what smart growth should be. Services, facilities, again, all of these things get enhanced, through this development process. As I said, we've upgraded our wastewater treatment plant. We have sufficient remaining capacity to achieve the type of development that we're talking about. Protecting infrastructure, because again, in the historic parts of town, some of that infrastructure is well over 100 years old. It's susceptible to flooding. Any interruption in the infrastructure is going to be catastrophic to the community. Just last year, as an example, Bristol County Water's water mains that come under the Providence River had breaks in them, and they had to go to a bypass system. But we were potentially a few days away from being in a boiled water situation for an extended period of time, which people don't think about that as being something that is a problem, but it is. So educating the public as to the vulnerability of infrastructure and the need to enhance it and protect it is critical as well. One last thing I'll say about the Belcher's Cove area where we're trying to move people out of. National Grid has both the gas pumping station as well as a substation right on Belcher's Cove that is also susceptible to flooding. So, long term, those issues are going to have to be addressed too. But, again, we're trying to be ahead of it in terms of protecting our residents to, have a plan to kind of retreat from that area and allow that area to be what it wants to be in terms of being able to, if there's going to be sea level rise and potential, seasonal flooding, that area can kind of accept that for the benefit of other parts of the community. And our timeline is now, working on it. As I said, we were anxious to get started on the public meetings with respect to the form-based code and the zoning amendments in February, and then the end of February, March hit. As we slowly get back to being able to have more public meetings in the fall, hopefully. We'll continue the conversation, but again, we've been, working with property owners, the larger property owners, kind of fine-tuning the build-out analysis, discussing what the financing opportunities are, discussing kind of the policy issues with respect to buyouts. That's been ongoing through this entire COVID crisis. So we've used this time to plan a little more. We know there's more studies that we need to validate what we're talking about. The fact that other groups have, saw the value in what we're trying to do and are supporting financing those studies, I think are all good things. And, we look forward to a year or 2 years from now updating you on the progress that we've made. And I think that might be it. Thank you, Arnold.
Okay, so we're going to have Michael sort of now talk about how we actually put this in the ground, finance it and put it in the ground.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Arnold, Bob, thanks for the work that you guys have been doing. Thank you for the work today, and thank you to GrowSmart for hosting this. Bob, it was great to hear you say that, one, you're working on a holistic approach and that you've engaged with us and Commerce and others early, because that's, I would say, one of the biggest opportunities in the funding and financing side is to engage early. And I'll touch on a little bit about that why. But I'm Michael Baer, Managing Director of the Infrastructure Bank. Most of you know the Infrastructure Bank, but if you don't, we are the centralized hub of local infrastructure investment and financing here in the state. We've been around for over 30 years, and I know we're talking about climate and resilience, and it's something that we've been talking about, I would say, a lot more lately, but we've been investing in providing financing for resilient projects really since the creation of the bank. We've financed projects that deal with stormwater runoff, that deal with hardening of pump stations, providing backup power in the early 90s through our programs. And so although we're taking this new focus on climate, we're really just incorporating it and seeing how we can take our existing programs, whether it's financing water, sewer, energy, roads, and make them more resilient, right? So what can our clients and how can we work with our cities and towns and municipalities to just think a little bit differently about how they're investing in infrastructure to make sure it's climate resilient. Next slide. The first program I wanted to talk about is the Municipal Resilience Program. When we at the Infrastructure Bank, whether it's myself, Jeff Deal, our CEO, Sean O'Rourke, our Director of Stormwater and Resiliency, talk to our clients and say, if we had a big pot of money for you, what would you do? What are your priorities? We don't necessarily get that quick response that we would expect about, here are the 5 things we want to do as it comes to investing in resilience. So the Municipal Resilience Program was created really to act as a pipeline builder, and a pipeline builder for both near-term, medium-term, and long-term projects. And this is a partnership between the bank and the Nature Conservancy, where we work with the communities to identify goals and aspirations, but using this climate or resilience lens and framework. We provide direct support to municipalities using and leveraging their local knowledge and previously done studies or previously identified projects. And we look to help prioritize those, but prioritize them with this resilience lens, really to ultimately protect infrastructure, protect community buildings, protect residents, businesses, from the impacts of extreme weather, natural hazards, climate. The process is to identify vulnerabilities and then opportunities. And this is not just a planning program, right? The goal of this program is to move into action. So last year we worked with 5 participating municipalities. Warren was one of them. It was about an 8-month, 7-month planning process. And then by the end of the year, we were able to announce grants for projects to move into implementation. So I know all of the communities we've worked with in the past year are moving towards that implementation. Really the goal is to get projects in the ground. And one way that we're working with communities through the Municipal Resilience Program is to, as we're working with them on identifying opportunities, trying to figure out where we see grant opportunities, where we see financing opportunities, where we see projects in municipal capital plans that could just be tweaked a little bit so you can use existing resources to make a project that is a priority for the city and town and wants to move forward today a little more resilient. But we do have action grant funding available to accelerate these priority projects. This year we're working with 9 municipalities in the state. We want to expand this all across Rhode Island to all 39 cities and towns over the next year or 2 years or so. And again, funding will be coming along with these projects. That's a big piece of here is we want to see action. It's really important for us to drive investment and then take those projects that were identified and move them to implementation, whether it's with MRP funding or with other funding that we'll be talking about. Next slide, please. So when Resilient Roadie was created a few years back, one of the chapters was thinking about how do we finance or pay for these projects, pay for climate resilience. And so what have we been doing here at the bank? We've been expanding our programs to include kind of climate resilience. It's not really expanding, it's just thinking differently about what we can do. For example, our Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which historically is really just focused on, we'll say, wastewater treatment facility and sewer infrastructure, where it can also be used for above ground stormwater. So rain gardens, bioswales, green streets, for example. And within that program, we also have a goal with EPA to invest a certain amount of money on an annual basis, about $1 million in green projects, which would qualify as above ground stormwater. We try to tie that with another priority of EPA, and that's to provide loan forgiveness or ultimately a grant. So we tie our green stormwater projects with our principal forgiveness. This is another way that we're taking an existing program and making it flexible enough for being able to work with our clients to show how existing programs can help meet their stormwater or climate goals. Another great example is the City of Central Falls worked with us as they were looking to upgrade the streets in Central Falls, and they undertook a Green Streets Initiative, and they used our Municipal Road and Bridge program, which you wouldn't necessarily think of as a climate financing program, to do comprehensive green streets in Central Falls using our Municipal Road and Bridge program. So we're being creative, kind of working with our partners, working with our clients on how to take existing programs and make them work with a climate lens. Next slide. So as you can see here, and this is in the Resilient Roadie report, there are existing tools for financing climate resilience. I think we all know this, and there are a number of different items, whether they're state resources at the bank, where our revolving loan funds, municipal bonding can be used for climate, energy savings performance contracts can be used for energy projects both at the municipal and at the private level. And call them natural systems or green systems. There are a number of different items that can be created that can drive new investment. Mitigation banking is an interesting opportunity where you can pay for environmental mitigation in certain areas, resilience in certain areas, and using those payments to offset potential permit requirements in a more dense area. All right, so you're making the most environmental impact in an area that needs it, versus in another area where you're focusing development. So you can offset a lot of your mitigation needs in another area. And again, community resilience, there are a number of resources, whether they're state, federal, or local. Next slide, please. So I want to look at some examples. Warren's a great example. This is not just Warren trying to drive development. It's going to take a village, right? And taking a village means the number of different stakeholders, another number of different people, businesses are going to be involved. And having a number of different, or a lot of different people involved, opens up we'll call it war chest, to access a lot of different resources or financial resources. So 2 examples I'd like to run through are how the bank has worked with both the City of Providence and other stakeholders in the City of Pawtucket in taking a number of different financial resources, kind of combining them to help them drive development, or in a smart growth way, but in a more densely approved strategic way for each area. Next slide, please. If you talk to Sean O'Rourke, you may hear him say kind of a funding quilt. And so as we work with our clients throughout their goals, whether it's with MRP or with our clients in municipal capital plans, we do look at what other opportunities, other than financing, other than using municipal budgets, that they can try to access to meet the goals of the community as it relates to infrastructure investment. So, when you look at the Woonasquatucket Greenway, this is a massive vision plan and initiative, and it takes both the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector to kind of all be aligned to drive change and to drive development. And there are a number of different resources, whether or not you're a public sector entity or private sector entity, that you can access to be more climate resilient. So one example is we're working with the Province Redevelopment Authority to put green infrastructure around the farm fresh facility that's going up into the Woonasquatucket corridor. We've worked with the Woonasquatucket River Watershed Council and the Department of Transportation to look at stormwater management needs, where the Department of Transportation will work with Woonasquatucket to build green infrastructure to help manage stormwater and to meet stormwater goals for the state. We've been able to work with Woonasquatucket that would combine that with a bike lane project. And then we provided money up front, because the RIDOT funding for those projects are reimbursable, to get that project started today. And then we will be paid back from the Department of Transportation. It's been a great partnership. It's really moved projects forward and faster than they would have moved in the past. Right in Woonasquatucket, you have a lot of mills, you have a lot of old buildings that you don't want to tear down, but you want to redevelop into something today, right? And that's where Rhode Island Commerce Department's build around tax credits come in. That's where federal historic tax credits come in. That's where the bank's brownfield revolving loan fund could come in to remediate any environmental remediation needs that need to be done. And also in these areas, you've seen our clients and our partners, such as Farm Fresh, such as West Pawtucket, River Watershed Council, access SNEP grants, National Fish and Wildlife grants, use bond funds from the prior green economy bonds to invest in stormwater, to invest in bike lanes, to invest in park infrastructure. So when there's a vision, when there's a plan, being able to go down the line and list and matrix out, what funding fits in what areas, and then how can we use state grant funding to then say also act as a match for maybe a federal opportunity. That's what we're seeing in Westerly, not necessarily on smart growth, but where Westerly sees an opportunity to protect a pump station, to restore a marsh, to dredge, but they need to provide that local match. They're looking at what other resources, either grant or financing resources, can they use from the bank, from the state, from nonprofits to act as that match. And so putting it all together makes it reasonable, makes it doable, rather than just taking the project as a whole, going holistically and breaking it down into its components parts and seeing what resources fit in those. And a lot of times what we're seeing is by doing that, you can move projects faster, right? You can get access to capital faster, one, because you prioritize what you want to do with these vision plans, and you're ready to move forward because you have an idea of what grants are available, what financing is available for the different types of improvements that need to be made. So we can move to the next slide. Right, and this is Pawtucket. Right, Pawtucket has huge development opportunities with both the train station that's coming in and Tidewater Landing. Pawtucket, as all the municipalities are one of our great partners here in the state. We've worked with them really recently as they've been doing stormwater work in the TOD district by the train station to access our Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund program to do green infrastructure work above ground, right? And we were able to provide them with loan forgiveness, so a grant, as well as a below market rate loan to accelerate that stormwater work in that area, right? Because they want to make it accessible, they want to make it attractive for new residents, existing residents in Pawtucket. A lot of their property owners are accessing our Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy program, which encourages and incentivizes private developers to make their existing buildings greener, or ground up new development, LEED standard, or have solar panels and things like that. We've been working with a number of developers in Pawtucket on brownfield. So how are we combining brownfield, right, remediating a mill, and then redeveloping that into a sustainable facility? Right, we're built around, and tax credits are being accessed by a number of private developers for the state, but also we're seeing SNEP grants, right? The city has been really focused on looking for other money for stormwater management, whether they're thinking about building, if you need to build more parking, centralized facilities, how are we doing that in a different way? The Green Economy Bond there have been access to brownfield grants. And then this is, Bob mentioned earlier, tax increment financing is an opportunity that the city of Pawtucket is also going to use that will help then, provide, to use that tax increment to invest in municipal infrastructure, to invest in other priorities of the city and within this area. One thing I like to say about the bank is we have the ability to work with cities and towns on tax increment financing. So our programs can take a tax increment financing pledge. So we can bring our even below market rate loans to work with our municipal partners to save even more money to get these projects done in the TIF approach. But if there's one thing I can say that to kind of summarize it all, it's one, Bob's right, it's a holistic approach. And as you're working on thinking about redevelopment in the smart growth way, talk to us about financing and grant opportunities, because we're trying to be helpful and be a provider of solutions, and not just financing. So we'd be happy to speak with all of you about what other resources we know that are available and how we can help kind of create that matrix of funding and financing options to make these investments, one, affordable for you all and a reality. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're going to call CJ, who's sort of our master of questions and answers, in as well. And I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can see the chat box as well for the program. So CJ, what do we have?
Yeah, we've got some questions. The first one is for Bob. This one is, how about a build-out analysis for Warren using these new construction and zoning ideas to see the impact on police and fire and schools and hospital needs?
Yep. So we have, I mean, we've done a build out analysis for the Metacom corridor, looking at various scenarios, mix of housing, office, retail, potentially some manufacturing. We started to engage Bristol Warren schools in a conversation about what the impacts would be, which again was interrupted by COVID. But one thing that we were seeing is that our school population was actually decreasing in Warren, and so consequently the amount of assistance we were getting from the state was decreasing with that. So we want to make sure that the schools are engaged in that conversation. Public safety is always part of the conversation when we're looking at new development. We don't have hospitals in Warren, but our rescue predominantly goes to Providence, occasionally to Newport, occasionally to Fall River. So I mean, yeah, certainly we don't do any of this without looking at what the impact is going to be, and that's again part of the ongoing conversation that we had. We've engaged our consultants again before we planned all that, making sure we have sufficient capacity at the wastewater treatment plant, working with Bristol County Water to make sure that there's adequate water pressure, both for the new development as well as for fire protection. So all of those stakeholders are brought in early to the conversation.
Great, thanks, Bob. So this one is for, I think, the both of you. Bear with me, it's a little bit long, but it's a very good question. Significant resources had been directed toward the redevelopment of the I-195 district in Providence during the Raimondo administration. This is certainly a worthwhile investment, but is a very large investment, and there are mixed reviews about the return on investment. With the new administration due in 2022, would it make sense for the municipalities across Rhode Island that are confronting significant impacts from sea level rise and other weather events to coalesce around advocacy to stress the need for significant statewide resources to put toward the redevelopment efforts, such as what Bob has suggested? I wonder whether stressing redevelopment as a way to adapt to sea level rise and climate crises in general, as opposed to trying to secure funding for mitigation for things like flood walls, raising buildings, etc., might have more resonance within the political and governmental establishment.
So I'll take it first, and then Michael can address it. I'm unabashedly a strong supporter of regionalism. I know that's a bad word to say in Rhode Island, but I think that going forward, it's something that we need to have. I think the conversations that we have started with respect to buyouts is bringing in people from the state, but other municipalities, and the infrastructure bank is part of that. Both Michael and Sean, both as the infrastructure bank and then as the state's resiliency officer. So yeah, I think that those are important. I think an interesting piece too is that post-COVID is what the demand for office space is going to be. Everyone's expectation is it's going to be less than what we thought it was previously, with people working remotely. We're seeing that the tourist conversion, the first phase has been fully occupied for the last 10 months. The second phase had a waiting list when they opened on July 1st. So I think, again, Warren's proximity to both Providence, to Aquidneck Island, and even if there's transportation improvements, in the Fall River area to connect better to Boston, we are a desirable community where people want to live. We've got a very vibrant food scene, very, very vibrant arts and cultural community. And there's, a sense of what Warren is, that what we're trying to preserve that in one sense by preserving the historic area and then, doing smart redevelopment in the Metacom area. But I find it difficult to, as I said earlier, you try to engage DOT, which is the state, in talking about effects of sea level rise on evacuation routes and highway improvement projects. It's near impossible. We've had conversations with the Army Corps of Engineers in terms of, building floodgates and flood walls, but the bureaucracy and just kind of the inertia in that process is so debilitating that we don't feel like we have the time to wait to have those conversations. So we need to kind of control our own destiny moving forward. But I'm all for having regional conversations about these things and having more engagement from the state level on some of the initiatives that not just Warren, other communities, Newport, Westerly, Warwick, all these communities are dealing with this. But we're all kind of in 39 different silos trying to, push these initiatives. And I'll yield to Michael.
One thing that I think we pride ourselves at the bank is, to kind of get around those silos. I think the municipal resilience program, right, being able to expand it to all 39 cities and towns will have a kind of one common framework, right, about how cities and towns are, how municipalities are prioritizing. We'll see a lot of synergies. We'll see a lot of things that look the same, or goals that are the same. Then how do we take that really and advance it through a statewide effort? It's, I think redevelopment as a way to adapt is correct, right? Do we need to be building, there's a place to be building new buildings. There's a place to be redeveloping. I think they both fit within an economic development strategy. But I think one thing I think we do need to get away from is this mitigation versus adaptation, and right, have a broad-based approach for climate investment. And that's one thing that we at the bank are starting to do. And I think municipalities can really take the lead on this.
Thanks to you both. So this is another one that's probably mostly for Michael. So this is from a Newport resident. She says, with the MRP that now Newport and Middletown are going to start, what can we get from the infrastructure bank?
So as part of the MRP process, currently Sean and our team at the bank are working to set up the first of will be many, at this point, public Zoom meetings that will help identify, right, those vulnerabilities, will help identify opportunities from the municipal and the public's viewpoint. Those, right, will be put together and packaged into a municipal resilience plan, going through this process with TNC, and that'll then lead to access for grant funding by the end of the year. All right, so ideally we're looking to identify either existing projects and make them more resilient, or identify new projects that may have just not risen up to the community at large across Middletown and Warren, and move that to implementation. So, right, it's not necessarily just a planning process. It's really to move towards, investment in kind of climate resilient infrastructure at the beginning of next year.
If I could just add to that, having, Warren having gone through the MRP process, you're prioritized for grant funding from the infrastructure bank, having successfully completed the MRP, and we've received some grant funding as a result of that. But also we use the results of the MRP process for the DEM green bond for partnered with Barrington again in terms of joint application for backup generators for pump stations, and then separately use that work to get funding to upgrade one of our other pump stations, which we wouldn't have been able to move as quickly and as comprehensive in our application had we not been through that MRP process. So it's a really valuable tool to bring people into the conversation from the community that you wouldn't think would necessarily be part of it. And unrelated to sea level rise, just as part of the process when we brought the emergency management people into the conversation, they developed an evacuation strategy for convalescent homes if there was a crisis. And we had a fire at one earlier this year. And because of what had happened through the MRP process, they had an evacuation plan in place that they were able to execute. So there's no downside to being part of the MRP process at all. It's all upside.
Yeah. One thing I'd add too for the Newport person that's the start of the MRP process is that having done this with several communities in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, there's really an opportunity if you can be involved in the MRP workshop itself to bring your priorities like that neighborhood flooding to the fore and have it be one of those high priority items. What really matters is what gets on into that MRP and how it's prioritized then determines how the community is going to seek funding, how it's going to change policy, and how it's going to take action. So that's really the chance to get this sort of pegged up high on the board so that as you're rolling into that grant funding and municipal allocations and you're making those changes, that it doesn't just end up in the plan, but it actually is on that list. And I've been impressed with both the Massachusetts and Rhode Island models, which is the Nature Conservancy, by having it not be this giant report, but instead kind of a really well thought out to-do list. Action is much more feasible. It's not buried in expertise, language, but it's actually really actionable. And advocates can have a huge impact in what gets on that list.
Awesome. Thanks to all three of you for that. This next one is mostly for Bob. Has Warren considered using transfer development rights in combination with the down zone special district in order to allow property owners losing value due to sea level rise to recover some value, i.e. transfer density from the waterfront areas to Metacom Ave?
We haven't, we don't have, our zoning ordinance really needs to be completely redone, but most of what you see in the historic area is that, maximum build out in terms of lot coverage and what's permitted. We don't have, the ability to say we're going to transfer air rights from that area over to the Metacom. The upside of Metacom as it exists now at a relatively conservative scale is more than what we need actually. And again, that's being sensitive to at some point, the wastewater treatment plant cannot handle anymore. And until we can have a regional conversation about perhaps not just having Warren wastewater treatment plant, but partnering with East Providence as an example, potentially, then, there's only so much new development that we can actually accomplish. I think there are other areas that are more urban or, have larger, underutilized, I would say Pawtucket is an area that could benefit from the transfer of development rights. We don't have large abandoned mills in our downtown area, unfortunately. What was there has been converted. But I think the concept, in certain areas is very applicable and should be considered.
Great, thanks, Bob. A little bit relatedly, New Jersey authorized the Blue Acres Pond about 10 years ago following 3 successive flood events in order to purchase private property that had been or was prone to inundation. I know Warren's done some work with this, but has Rhode Island considered this legislatively?
Probably not. I don't think, there hasn't been, from the state level, certainly, Sean has participated both in his role as the resiliency officer as well as representing the bank along with Michael. Laura Sullivan from Department of Administration, in her housing and community development role has participated. We haven't had a lot more engagement from the state level. It's a strategy that we're thinking about. How do we present this? Some of the buyouts that have happened have been bad experiences, so we don't want to replicate that. But I just personally, and it's in my opinion, I don't know that the state's ready to have that conversation yet. I think it's incumbent on us to have a really well articulated strategy and plan to bring to them as opposed to this, here's what we're thinking about, what do you think? Because I don't think that's going to go anywhere.
Yeah, and this, I've been involved in. I mean, there are a lot of conversations being had at, I would say, the state level, in partnership. So with URI, with the municipalities, right? There are a lot of different. The needs for municipalities on a buyout basis are very different, right? Whether you're in Warren or Cranston or Westerly, right? They're all very different, and so, you know, this, I'll say the state has been thinking about this. You know, legislatively, nothing has moved, but it's a topic that we are actively looking at, but it's very complicated.
And I think, Michael and Bob, one of the things you allude to is that most of our buyout discussions in regard to eventual sea level rise or storm impact we haven't seen yet becomes theoretical. And we sort of have these discussions that, well, if this happens, then these are the dangers. I think one of the advantages of the project that you're going to do, Bob, is with your SNEP funding, is going to be to actually calculate for a set area sort of what are those values and what are, you know, we're going to be looking at exact mapping and what are those dangers. And that will make it more quantified than I think it's been for a lot of zones that have been looked at in the state. And then you can, whether you factor that back into redevelopment on Metacom or you simply understand risk in a more detailed way, that allows those discussions to take place. And that becomes the basis to tie into the Blue Acres question. I think Massachusetts, thinking regionally across state boundaries, is a really good model in terms of how they're funding their climate resiliency, but more importantly, how they're building political coalitions for climate resiliency. They've had success in getting their legislative and executive branches together because there is a strong coalition pushing the state to say, you need to invest in this. There's also some visionary leadership from the elected folks too. But I think that that's one thing that across Rhode Island is happening, where environmental groups are getting together with business groups and across, you know, boundaries. But I think it needs to become more quantifiable, and the asks, as you say, Bob, more specific.
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, it's, you know, when there's a hurricane, there's a tornado, there's a wildfire, if people see it on the news and they see instantaneously what the impact of that is. If you're talking about, you know, a foot of sea level rise over 50 years, that's hard for people to visualize what that is. So with the SNEP money that we anticipate getting, you know, it's, again, you know, as Michael said, it's bringing as many people to the table as you can. So if your interest in this redevelopment is from an environmental standpoint, okay, we're going to look at that. If your interest in this is from a housing standpoint, okay, we're going to look at that. And to be able to bring those various constituencies coalesce, you know, around the same goal is very important. But again, it gives people ownership in terms of the solution to the problem, as opposed to, you know, again, the theoretical is difficult for people. You know, it's no different than, as I mentioned earlier, you know, having a rendering of the building. People need to, what is that going to look like? Because the abstract is difficult for most people to understand.
I think this is probably going to be our last question. Thank you, everyone, for your excellent questions. If anyone does have more of them, feel free to write to me or John. I think you've gotten our emails from signing up for this, and we can forward them along to these fine folks here. So this one I'm also very curious to hear an answer for, which is there a strategy for engaging or empowering the Rhode Island Department of Transportation, RIDOT, to be more proactive in the area of mitigation and resilience?
I hope so. Again, I mean, I can only speak, and this is not the position of the town of Warren, this is Bob's position. They're difficult to communicate with. I mean, again, it's stormwater or sea level rise notwithstanding. I mean, you know, you come into town one day and they're digging up a road and you didn't even know about it. So, I mean, you know, we've implored in our conversations with Sean to help us get a seat at the table to talk about some of these issues. I just haven't seen it come to fruition yet. I'm hopeful that it will, but as I said, you know, there's the amended TIP plan that's out there, talks about significant reinvestment on the Market Street corridor where we're planning to do some things. And there's no specifics as to what that is. So I don't know if that has sea level rise is being addressed. Don't know if stormwater is being addressed or they're just repaving the road.
And I think one of the things we found when we began to look at this issue broadly as a firm is that states vary widely in those who are studying the issue to understand impact. That's great to do that, but then taking the next step, which is to say, is there a prioritized rating plan for roads that are evacuation routes and in danger from inundation or damage, and how that goes. And maybe I'll talk to CJ and John offline. I'm happy to share some of that research. But I haven't seen yet in Rhode Island that proactivity of a plan to look at those key routes to make them more resilient.
Great. So once again, thank you so much to everyone for being here. Thanks especially to our wonderful panelists here. We will again have more Wednesday webinars coming up all the way through September. So head to our website, check out the list, and sign up for ones that sound good to you. Thanks again for being here, everybody. If you have any more questions, email me. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, folks.